Can I firstly introduce myself? I'm Alan Tuckett. I'm a Professor of Education here, and I, for my sins, help coordinate the faculty's public lecture series and their relationship to inaugural lectures and so on, so that we've got a fair stream across our broad-based faculty of things on offer in education, in health and wellbeing, sport and psychology. And we try and space those out every year, though we don't always manage to get our timings entirely articulated. And tonight's is one of the education sequence in that, and the speaker, Tom Wilson, has just, before Christmas, joined the university as a visiting fellow, which we're delighted about, because just before he retired in December, we've signed up with a memorandum of understanding with Union Learn. Union Learn really is Tom's great triumph. There are 30,000 people across Britain who are trade unionists and volunteers and who represent their workforce to management to make sure that managers recognise the value of investing in learning for their staff, and also to encourage their peer group in a dynamic way to join in. Frankly, an awful lot easier than having your boss say, why don't you do some learning, to have one of your mates. And part of the heart of the history of this is the view that, the shift from a view that the job of trade unions was to secure pay and conditions, and to move to recognising that occupation was the issue, and the better qualified you are, or at least better ready for learning you are, the more likely you are to survive and thrive in a world in which jobs don't last forever. Now, inevitably, in the context of Tom's work as the lead person for education in the TUC, arguing across a lifetime for the benefit of levies and so on, we see some of the positive fruition of that at a time when other aspects of post-compulsory learning have had a desperate few years. Recently I saw a slide and helped create one which showed universities have increased in their budgets as a result of student fees by 26% in the last 5 years, and further education has dropped by 15%, and the same even in higher education. The drop of mature student participation has been dramatic. Hard to find a place where adults can easily learn now. So tonight, when we look at what makes for a good apprenticeship, we're looking for what Raymond Williams used to call resources of hope from Tom. And it's deeply pleasing to have you here, Tom, and he's happy to be interrupted and take questions as you go along, and doubtless one of you will want to model that to help us get it going, but unless they do, the floor is yours.
The thing about the TUC is it's actually 6 million workers, about 300 staff, and it was brilliant for me because I was part of that whole kind of enterprise that was driving forward a new agenda for skills, and really running the custom work in a way which is still there. And one of the things I want to talk about tonight is apprenticeships, partly because there's been such a strong, wonderful tradition within the trade union movement of arguing for good quality apprenticeships. And what I want to try and do is to kind of reinvent, what does a good apprenticeship look like? What counts as good in modern apprenticeships? So what I was going to do is talk for, 40-45 minutes or something. I mean, stop me when it gets boring. Please interrupt at any point. And I have both a sort of written script, which I shall be reading from at various points, but also kind of PowerPoint to try and liven things up a bit and make it a bit less dull, and impose some kind of structure on my rambling remarks. What I'll be doing is kind of talking a bit from the script, talking a bit from the PowerPoint, and hopefully maybe answering one or two questions and seeing where the discussion goes as well. So, let's begin. And do by all means say if you can't hear me or if anything doesn't make any sense. First thing to say really is that at the moment apprenticeships are all the rage in the world of adult skills. You can hardly hear anything about skills these days without it being about apprenticeships. Why? And why has the government adopted this policy of seeking 3 million apprentices, or other apprenticeship starts, which is a slightly different thing, by 2020? And why has a kind of free market conservative government adopted the levy, which is a form of regulation, an imposition on the free market, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd think this government would want to do? So that almost every single employer, probably except those with around about 150 or 200 staff, will have to pay for an apprenticeship, whether or not they're providing one. So that's a big, big change in the landscape. And it's been calculated that the apprenticeship levy will introduce something like 2 billion, could be 3 billion extra on top of, the government claims, on top of the existing spending on apprenticeships. Now, a lot of people will say it's going to substitute at least in part. But whether it does a bit or not, that is a fantastic amount of new money. And as Alan's just pointed out, when we're thinking about the catastrophic fall in adult education funding and in FE funding, there has to be a kind of rebalancing. And it's very interesting that the rebalancing is taking the form of all the new money being channeled into apprenticeships. So that's why apprenticeships are so important, and that's what I want to talk about. There's the image of apprentices. Young, they all look young. You probably can't see it too well, so I'll bring a picture, but as you can see, they all look as if they're kind of in their late teens. Actually, about a third of apprentices are in their late teens. Secondly, they're all white. Very unusual, actually. Probably about a third of apprentices these days are not white. And they all look as if they're kind of doing something vaguely kind of manual. You know, the blokes are all kind of spanners and greasy overalls and the girls all hair and beauty. Actually, not true. The top apprenticeship is in business admin, the second top is in health and social care, the third is in business services. Actually, the number of apprentices that are in engineering is around about 1 in 10. So all of the kind of images of apprenticeships that you see in the press and the media are simply not true. And one of the things I'm going to do is talk a bit about the reality of what apprenticeships are really all about. But I thought I'd begin with some fundamentals. Firstly, what's kind of special about apprentices? And I'd say there's kind of 4 fundamental issues. Firstly, that they are designed for young people, just like university is. Not entirely, of course, as I've just said, there's plenty of older people. But they're designed to play a major role in the social and professional formation of young people. And in Germany, for example, until very recently, you didn't get your apprenticeship if you had a criminal record. Because in Germany, they took the view that apprentices should be upstanding citizens who would be role models for their profession. And if you had some sort of criminal record, or if you'd done something that was a bit not great in the community, in the eyes of the community, that was meant you were not going to be a fit person to be an apprentice. And there's still a bit of that around, that sort of thinking about, it's not just about education and skills for work, it's also your social formation, that you're going to be a proper, upstanding young person. And that's a bit different. I mean, that sort of test is not applied, I would imagine, to university graduates. Or do I?
It depends on the course, though.
That's very true. That is very true, yes. Some of them it certainly should be, it is. Second, really, is that apprentices are, I think, almost a unique combination of work and study. I can't think, they probably are, but I can't think of any other kind of educational form where the student is legally required to be an employee. A lot of people don't get that, and certainly in some colleges still, people are called apprentices when they're not employees, and that is legally now outlawed. Third, apprenticeships, of course, suffer from the stigma of being seen as second class. Alison Wolfe memorably said that everyone's in favour of them, provided they're for other people's children, not your own children. For young men, they're associated with kind of oily rags and garages and building sites. For young women, they're seen as the way into hair and beauty or secretarial or admin jobs. Neither stereotype is remotely true, as I just said, but that's how they're seen in the UK. In the UK, not seen that way in many other countries of the world. And then the fourth fundamental issue, I think, that's worth noting, is that apprentices, because of the other 3 issues, are uniquely vulnerable to exploitation. Because they're young, because they're very, unsupported at work, if you like, they are uniquely vulnerable to exploitation, and that takes the form of effectively being used as cheap labour very often, and we're all pretty aware, I'd have thought, of the kinds of horror stories, you know, Morrison's, the supermarket, that employed apprentices for 6 months on, I think it was £2.27 an hour in those days. It's only about 3 years ago. And at the end of the 6 months, they would all got fired. A new lot of apprentices came in. These weren't real apprenticeships. This was just basically 6 months of exploitation as cheap labour. And if you think 6 months is bad, Next had a Christmas apprenticeship, which employed people on 6-week slots over the Christmas busy period from December to, I think, the middle of January or something. And they were called apprentices for precisely 6 weeks. And it was a completely bogus scheme. It was simply designed to get cheap labour running the next stores over the Christmas thing. Both of those have been outlawed, by the way, because the minimum period now, of course, is a year. And part of that was due to pressure from the unions, which, you know, persuaded the then coalition government to introduce the 1 year minimum. But as I'll say, I think 1 year is far too low anyway. It should be at least 2 or 3 hours. So trade unions, just to come back to the trade union point really, we have a long history of tackling this exploitation point, which is not just about exploitation as cheap labour, it's also about unsafe working conditions. It's only 3 years since a 16-year-old apprentice in their first week at work was killed at Shore Docks because they were unloading a ship with no idea what they were doing, and a piece of machinery killed them because they had no training and nobody knew what was going on. That kind of thing, thankfully, doesn't happen so much these days, but it's still a real risk. Far more accidents happen to young people than to older people, for obvious reasons. So those are the fundamental issues. And it's just worth bearing those in mind as I go on to talk about the other issues that are so important to do with pay, equality, breadth, duration, length, funding, all the rest of it. Because those 4 fundamental issues, they don't really apply in the same way to most any other students. So apprenticeships are kind of unique. They're a strange kind of hybrid between the world of education and the world of work. If you think about it from the perspective of apprentices themselves, I've always been struck when I go around and talk to apprentices, and I say, well, what course are you on? And they often haven't a clue. Well, is it a BA, or is it MVQ, is it level 3, level 2? Don't know, mate. But what they say is it's going to get them a job. And it's going to get them a job in an occupation. And that's what's really important to them. So they know who they're working for, and they know what it's going to lead to. Not too much bothered about what sort of certificate they're going to get. So perhaps they should be, but they're often not. So from the perspective of apprentices, a good apprenticeship is primarily a route into an occupation, not just a job, but an occupation, and there's a difference. And above all, something which conveys a sense of pride and identity. If you think about the kinds of traditional apprenticeships, it's been in construction as bricklaying, plastering, electrician, those are real big occupations. You know, if you're a skilled plasterer, let's say, and you've done your 3 years as an apprenticeship, you will know how to run a plastering company. You'll be able to do elaborate coving around corners of, old Victorian houses. You'll know about the different kinds of plaster work you need to do in different fire environments. You'll know all sorts of issues to do with different kinds of plastering. Far more than most people even aware of. I only know this because a good friend of mine, their son, is an apprentice plasterer. Otherwise, I wouldn't know either. But that's the kind of broad occupation, which is different from just a narrow job. And so, from the union point of view, to put it very simply, what we want, what unions want, is fewer, bigger, and longer apprenticeships, which lead to substantial occupations, careers, or professions. From an employer point of view, frankly, they don't see why they should train people for more than the specific particular job that they might need at that particular time. So there's always that sort of tension that goes on. And that's why over the years, national agreements have been negotiated between unions and employers, covering entire sectors such as engineering or construction. And the purpose of those agreements was to ensure that large, high-quality apprenticeships were sustained. And the importance of that from the employer's point of view was that if everybody was in, all the employers, then they could see the advantage of that, because that helped every employer to have high-quality apprenticeships. But as soon as just a few employers were not in that agreement, they could then undercut the remainder, and you then get a race to the bottom. And oddly enough, that meant that part of the union job was to organise the employers and get all the employers into the agreement, which actually many employers would agree with, particularly the better ones. And then finally, while I'm still sort of setting the scene, it's worth mentioning traineeships. They're gradually, I think, becoming accepted as a kind of entry route into apprenticeships, slowly. And when the levy was announced and I had a meeting with Nick Bowles, the Minister, I did ask him, are you going to include traineeships under the levy as eligible expenditure for the levy? And he said, well, not just yet, but he hoped that in the course of time that would eventually evolve as being the natural thing to do. Because more and more employers will say, well, in order to get onto an apprenticeship, you do the traineeship first. If you pass the traineeship, then fine, you're on the apprenticeship. But without some kind of entry standards and an entry route into an apprenticeship, it's very hard to kind of maintain the standards of what an apprenticeship is itself. Exactly the same as university. You need to have entry thresholds as well as exit thresholds. So, that's setting the scene. First thing I want to talk about is equality and diversity. And the reason I want to talk about that first is because actually very few people do. And in all the discussion about apprenticeships, you don't often hear much about equality and diversity. Segregation by gender and race is still widespread, arguably more so, I would say, than in any other area of education. I can't imagine any university course in the country where you would accept 97.6% of the students all being male or female. And that is typical in construction or hairdressing or even social care, typical in engineering and so on. I know it's difficult, and I know there are many courses where there are high proportions of either men or women, but I do think in the world of apprenticeships, it is carried to an extreme, typically, commonly, that you just don't see almost anywhere else. In 2013, the TUC commissioned some research from the Institute for Employment, which looked at gender and race in apprenticeships and showed that both BME and women apprentices were massively overrepresented in all the low-paying sectors, like social care, like hair and beauty and so on. And of course, non-BME and male apprentices were in all the higher-paying sectors, like engineering, electronics and IT. There was a very good analysis done by Lorna Unwin and Alison Fuller for the Institute of Education in 2013, which explored the implications of the raising of the participation age. If you think about it, that's bound to have a big impact on apprentices, because more and more young people will be going into an apprenticeship at 16, or 17 or 18. And the consequences of that, they were arguing, and I think this has been borne out so far, is that there are more, there's more segregation, and there's more of a gender pay gap emerging. Last year, there was an interesting survey done by the Young Women's Trust, which found that the average women apprentice earned £4.82 and the average male apprentice earned £5.85. Now that might not seem like a big cash difference, but it's a big proportionate difference. And Jeremy Crook, who's chair of the Biz Apprenticeships Advisory Group, or it was, he's not anymore, he highlighted very interestingly that around about 1 in 4 of all people who apply to become an apprentice are BME, but only 1 in 10 of actual starts at BME. So you do the math and you can work out the extent of disproportionate acceptance rates. And in 2011-12, around about, sorry, I just made that point, about 25% as opposed to 10%, and it's got slightly better. There was a very interesting Biz survey that came out last autumn, which showed that there was a bit of an improvement, but it's very, very slow. So what do we do about that? I think there's 2 things that are very, very important from the kind of union perspective. From my own personal experience, going around schools, talking to young people, and I've done quite a lot of that, as soon as you start talking about pay and the career opportunities and the difference between what that is in engineering, electrical, IT, transport, and let's say hair and beauty, social care, public, it does not make a difference. People are not daft. Young people are not daft. And as soon as you say to particularly young women, look, you know, the world of construction isn't necessarily all about muddy building sites. There's plenty of other, you know, if that puts you off, it doesn't put some women off, it might put some on. And similarly to men, if you say, actually, you know, the world of engineering is pretty tough, it's quite high standard, you might not make it, have you thought about something else? And so you have a kind of balanced approach. You can actually begin to get a much more sensible conversation going, and people make much more rational choices. But above all, you have to have very good quality careers advice, which is going to equip schools to give the young people that kind of information. I would say reforms are also needed in the collection of monitoring of data on apprentices. We've just talked about gender and race. Actually, if you think about disability, or say sexual orientation, there's almost no data collected on those kinds of common reasons for prejudice and harassment and discrimination. And we've been lobbying and arguing with BIS that they should begin to do that, and are now beginning to do that, but it's very, very slow. And then there's some practical reforms, such as improving careers guidance, including recruitment practices and childcare support for parents who are undertaking apprenticeships. There's almost no childcare support for apprentices, whereas there is, of course, for higher education students. Not much, you might say, but at least there's some. And interestingly, there is no part-time route to apprenticeship. So if you're a single mum, what do you do with the kids? So there are some practical things that could be done to sort of drag the whole apprenticeship framework into the common parlance of how education systems work. So I wanted to start with some of those issues about equality and diversity, because I think that is very, very important to bear in mind as a kind of touchstone. What would count as good? And any good apprenticeship, and there are plenty of very good apprenticeships around, tackle equality and diversity up front, seriously and openly. So, for example, if you go to, say, Lang O'Rourke, they very proudly will tell you that their construction apprenticeships are at least 1/4 women. I don't know if it's true, but that's what they're aiming at, that's what they claim. Similarly, Rolls-Royce will talk about, if you get a Rolls-Royce apprenticeship, you're far more likely to be able to get one of those if you're BMW than if you apply to some other apprenticeship somewhere else. And Rolls-Royce make a real effort to kind of reach out to those communities. So now let's turn to some of the apprenticeship topics that have received a bit more attention. Recent reforms have seen employers being put in the driving seat. This in the driving seat for employers. It's a kind of favourite phrase that the ministers keep shouting out. What do we think about that? Who decides what counts as an apprenticeship? Who's in control? The phrase "in the driving seat" conjures up a metaphor of somebody driving a car or a train or something. Well, obviously you only have one person in the driving seat.
Jeremy Clarkson.
Jeremy, well, I hope not. Are we all just passengers in the back? Now, what's the union point of view on this? Where unions start from is that there's far too many apprenticeships that are low quality and don't meet either employer needs or the needs of apprentices. That's why 9 out of 10 employers don't have apprentices. Interesting fact. 9 out of 10 employers don't have any apprentices, including half of all employers who employ more than 500 people. So it's not just the small employers. I think the big ones don't either. It's also why so many people think apprentices for other people's children, because they're just not very good, is the impression. And it's true that the best apprentices are those which are designed and owned by employers. But not just by employers. And this is the point. The best apprenticeships are those which are designed and run and funded by employers, but in conjunction with trade unions. And of course, unions strongly support employers taking far more responsibility for apprenticeships, but entirely employer-led design risks what I was talking about earlier, of leading to very narrow, very sort of job-based rather than occupational-based apprenticeships, which are pretty short-term and only meet the immediate needs of employers and don't actually cater for the broader range of skills needed. And also, young people need the chance to move between employers, and actually that's very good for the sector as a whole. And big employers will be the first to admit that. And the government, of course, has got a big interest in promoting mobility across sectors and between sectors, because that's how you develop skills and that's how economies grow. So there's a difference between the immediate needs of employers and the broader needs of their sector and the broader needs of the country. And balancing all that out is why it is not sensible to have just employers in the driving seat. And I think, good employers see that, I think government sees that, but it'll be very interesting to see the composition of the new Institute for Apprenticeships, which is the national board that's going to run the levy, and to see how many people on that are not just employers. And when I spoke to Nick Bowles, Minister, back in October about this, he said that they were quite keen for it not to be just employers, and that there would certainly be a space for unions and others, educational experts and so on. But I think it remains to be seen just what is the composition and the balance of that. Is it going to be a third, like the Low Pay Commission, which is a third employers, a third unions, and a third experts? That's one model. And that's the model being supported incidentally by the CBI and the TUC. Or is it going to be sort of 70% employers, and then a couple of unions and a couple of experts and so on? I think there's a big difference. I think one of the things that many people have got hung up on is this whole issue about trailblazers. Can I just ask you to stick up your hands if you know all about trailblazers? Good. Because I'm sure you would, yes. Not many people do. But what they're supposed to be is a whole new initiative which is kind of designed to simplify and improve the quality of apprenticeship frameworks in certain key occupations, like aerospace, pharmaceutical and so on. The problem is they tend to be dominated by employers. So in the world of aerospace, you've got aerospace and Airbus, and that's about it. So they're designing an apprenticeship framework which is great for them, but isn't particularly good for anybody else who works in aerospace. Now, what's the union view about trailblazers? On the whole, we kind of support them because the current apprenticeship scene is so fragmented and various and disparate that having anything that simplifies it and constructs fewer and bigger apprenticeship frameworks is good. But having said that, it's interesting that in Germany there are around about 320 broad apprenticeship frameworks. Currently in the UK, we're running at over 140 trailblazers, and we've kind of gone even halfway through now. It's quite likely that we'll end up with probably something like 500 or 600 trailblazer standards, which is the equivalent of a kind of apprenticeship framework. In other words, roughly double the number that they have in Germany. And the only conclusion you can draw from that is, on average, each one of those will be half the size of a typical German apprenticeship. Which country has the best apprenticeship system in the world by common consent? Germany. And in Germany, of course, the employers argue and say, well, they're far too big and they wish they were a bit more like us and they had only 600 or something, which would be smaller and narrower. And all the British unions are saying, no, we want to be more like Germany so that we have fewer and bigger and longer apprenticeships. And, you know, that's the nature of the debate about rent, if you like. And there is that tension between, you know, a long-term aspiration to a 3 or 4 year apprenticeship, which many good employers subscribe to, and then the short-term cost pressures. And getting a kind of joint approach involving all of the stakeholders, government, employers, unions, and educational partners, that's really the key to getting the right balance between all of those pressures. And Hilary Steedman, who's a well-known professor on educational economics, noted that, quote, in all apprenticeship countries, except Australia and England, most apprenticeship programs take 3 years to complete, or in the case of Ireland, 4 years. Actually, in Germany, they're about 4 years too. Note the exceptions there. The rest of the world, except for Australia and England, has got 3 or 4 years. Our average is just over 1 year, about a year and 2 months. So we've got a long way to go in terms of breadth and duration. Those facts and figures probably I should have put a bit earlier on, but never mind, we've covered those anyway. As you can tell, my synchronization between the PowerPoint and the talk is not perfect.
Nearly all are apprenticeship.
I think it's quite right. It's interesting to think about what would an apprenticeship look like for trade union officials, when it's being an activist in the workplace, being a shop steward, that kind of thing. What do we want to pay? Because in many ways, this question goes to the heart of the whole debate. And many apprentices, the first thing they notice is the pay rate, and that's the first thing that puts them off. Anybody know what the current apprenticeship pay rate is?
£3.
Thank you very much. Probably still there. Just testing. Now, that applies, interestingly, to 16 to 18-year-olds, but also to anybody else in the first year of their apprenticeship. Now, you know what we said earlier on, you've got an awful lot of older people in their 20s, so you can have 25, 26, 27-year-olds in the first year of apprenticeship being paid £3.30 an hour. It's just bizarre. And the reality is that it often doesn't happen because employers know that they can't really quite get away with that. But in theory, that's the way the current system is structured. There's been a lot of talk about the new living wage that Osborne introduced, and that's very welcome, £7.20, but it only applies to people aged over 26. And I've talked to Tesco's, to Whitbreads, to John Lewis, and they're going to employ a lot more under 26-year-olds. That's what they say. They're very open about it. And you know, we can blame them. the government's policy will do wonders for the youth unemployment rate. Whether they are going to take the form of apprenticeships is a different matter. Hopefully they will. Hopefully the levy will push them in that direction. But actually, you could end up with an awful lot of young people being paid on a £3.30 rate. And when they get to 26, suddenly find that they're out of a job. So we need to watch that one very carefully. And then if you look at the extent of illegal underpayment, even on the £3.30, it is astonishing, I think. You've got one in seven, the 2014 survey showed that 24% of 16 to 18-year-olds, that's a quarter, and of all apprentices it was about 1 in 7, weren't even getting that £3.30. You have to be working pretty hard as an employer to pay people less than £3.30 an hour. Now, what employers say is that they don't realise that when an apprentice's birthday comes along and they turn from 16 to 17 or 17 to 18, the pay rate has to go up. Not really. Why wouldn't they know that? It's very well publicised. Unions go around publicising it. Why is it so, 42% in hairdressing, almost half of all all apprentices in hairdressing are not even being paid the legal minimum wage. So what's happening on enforcement? Why isn't somebody doing something about that? That's criminal. And following the passage of the Apprenticeship Act that this has gone through, theoretically, the employers will be committing a criminal offence. So it's very interesting. A lot of people's reaction to the levy has been to say, oh, well, on the one hand, you're going to bludgeon us by making us pay lots of money that we don't want to pay. On the other hand, you're going to threaten us with being dragged off in chains to the jail if we don't. So this free market government is adopting, on the whole, a fairly draconian approach to try and tackle some of these problems. Which, as a trade unionist, I would say is long overdue. Whether that's the best way to do it, I doubt very much, frankly. And I think many hairdressing salons probably have no idea what they're doing. It's not necessarily their fault, it's because it's very badly communicated, badly policed, there's not much support out there, people don't explain it properly. But nonetheless, it is a massive problem. So that's about the legal minimum and the extent of underpayment. But beyond the legal minimum, how much should apprentices get paid? And that's a very interesting question. For many employers, it's the key question. Most employers will say, well, whatever the levy is, it only makes sense to us to hire apprentices if we can actually hire good quality ones, doing a good quality apprenticeship, and then we're prepared to pay them, provided they're going to go to a place that trains them well. And across the developed world, unions see this kind of trade-off. At the outset, when apprentices are not contributing a great deal, they're paid far less towards the end of their apprenticeship when they're much, much more productive. And the trade-off is usually negotiated. In most countries, apprentices' pay is covered by collective agreements, sitting above the actual legal minimum, and which stipulate what apprentices should get in their first year, second year, third year, and so on. So Germany, for example, apprentices' pay is covered by sectoral agreements, engineering, construction, pharmaceutical, and so on, and or regional, so you get paid slightly differently in Bavaria from Lower Saxony or whatever. And the rates do vary, so that in 2012, according to government figures, the average apprenticeship bricklayer was on €986 a month, and that went up, successively over the 3 years of their apprenticeship. The same for hairdressers and so on. You'd be interested to know that an apprentice hairdresser in Germany at the same time was getting €454. So even in Germany, there was that big difference. But nonetheless, those rates are much higher than the equivalent rates in Britain because they don't quite cover the same degrees of expenditure. And I could give lots more details and so on. Much closer to home in Ireland, the construction industry agreement that was signed in 2011 and has been annually updated ever since, and which was introduced after the massive economic crash in 2008, and was part of the whole kind of rebuilding the Irish economy, stipulated, and think how important construction is to the Irish economy. Irish builders are famous the world over. In the first year, apprentices are paid 33% of the national rate. Second year, 50%. Third year, 75%. Fourth year, 90%. So that's the kind of negotiated stepping up. And then when they finally qualify, then they go on to the 100% full rate. Similarly in the Netherlands and in Italy and so on and so on. Now, what we found was that in the UK, back in 2011, BIS did a survey of apprentices' actual pay. 11,000 apprentices, the biggest survey that had ever been done. And the average hourly rate of pay was £5.87. That was for the first year, but bear in mind that most apprentices only had 1 year, so it barely went up in their second year. The kind of median weekly pay was about £200, so that's a good deal higher, but that included some real skews at the top end for apprenticeships in engineering, electronics, IT, pharmaceuticals, and the average is a good deal lower than that. So, although the survey showed that 4 out of 5 received on or above the minimum amount, what it really looked at, if you notice the skewing at the top end, was that most apprentices received actually only just above the minimum amount. If you got a lot more, but not many. So, cut to the chase, what does all this blizzard of numbers tell us? Firstly, the UK has got far more short-term 1-year apprenticeships than is the norm. They're far worse paid than the norm, much closer to the legal minimum. And in most other countries, the rate of progression is much more substantial. So in most other countries, there's a strong attraction, even if your apprenticeship starts at quite a low rate, because you know that in years 3, 4 and so on, you'll begin to get something much more close to the adult rate. We also did some work when I was at the TUC, looking at countries across Europe. And the 2 countries that we found in Europe that were closest to the UK were Estonia and Malta, or Cyprus. Now they were just emerging and they're just beginning to establish their own apprenticeship systems, and they were basically developing economies that couldn't afford very much and were very, very low paid. So the question we're left with is, why is our apprenticeship framework closer to that of Estonia and Malta and Cyprus than Germany or France or Italy? What kind of economy do we want? What kind of economy have we got, actually? Our economy at the moment is much closer to that of Germany. But if we don't adopt something closer to a German kind of training system, vocational education, we will be inevitably drifting towards an economy that looks a bit closer to that of Estonia or Malta or Cyprus. So I'll leave you with that question. 3 quick points really in terms of what we should do about that. Firstly, properly enforced legal minimum rates. Second, much higher quality apprenticeships, so there's a quid pro quo. For a low starting rate, you get something much higher. And third, that the appropriate rate of pay on a 2 or 3 year apprenticeship, and most should be at least 2 or 3 years, should reflect the productivity of that apprentice. So if you're working in a shop, and actually probably within 6 months you're generating far more in profits than you are in cost of the employer, probably less than 6 months, then there's a strong case for the actual pay rate for that apprentice being closer to the adult rate. That's probably less true in, say, pharmaceuticals or some more complex area where it may take much longer to learn how to be productive. That's fair enough, and that's why you negotiate a different rate. Following on from all that, that's what I've just talked about. Now, careers guidance. Tremendous quote there from Michael Wilshire. You're not to hear Sir Michael being quite as blunt and forthright as that. To actually call it a disaster, I mean, that's pretty strong words. And I don't know how many of you actually read the Ofsted report on apprenticeships that came out last autumn, but it was devastating, absolutely devastating. It really didn't pull its punches. And I must say there was a bit of me that thought, hang about, who's been presiding over all this? Who's responsible for the inspection and guidance of the school system, if not Sir Michael himself? And yet it's as if it's all out there somewhere, and they've just discovered this astonishingly bad system of careers advice, which everybody else has been howling about for the last how many years you can think of. Anyway, better the sinner that repenteth, even if it's a bit late in the day. So it was very nice to have that quote, and it's very nice that he was so forthright about it. I've got to say, they haven't exactly done much since. And in our experience, talking to the teacher unions, I'm sure many of you will know this better than I do, what the teacher unions say is that the reason they are not allowed to talk to young people in the classroom about apprenticeships is because the school may suffer. Because if many of their bright students go off to do an apprenticeship rather than go to university, the school leadership team will be saying to them, hang about, what's that going to do for our position in the league tables? And it's very, very sad. And Wilshire knew that, and said nothing about it. And many of the teaching unions have made those points very, very forcibly to Ofsted and to the government at various times. And until somebody does something about that, and begins to reform the way in which schools report on their progress, and people going into apprenticeships is given equal status and equal billing, if you like, with people going to university, then I fear that we will always have this disadvantage with apprenticeship advice and education being given much lower profile, much less resources than other forms.
We find it very, very difficult to get foots in the doors through schools. That then they're not really very forthcoming in wanting to.
But do you think it's for that reason?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
It's shameful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we've published guidance published by the TUC to help teachers in the classroom, which we've distributed around schools, and the teachers have kind of used it surreptitiously because they've been a bit worried about whether they should be officially giving leaflets and guidance to young people about apprentices, and that's how bad it's gone.
In a world dominated by metrics, you have to think about whether schools might be rewarded not on their exam results but on employment outcomes for young people this many years down the road. That way you'd get a slight change of behaviour, wouldn't you? So it's not going to happen in a hurry, is it?
But there's much talk about it, so we live in hope. But I think things are changing on this front, but very, very slowly. Funding, I'm going to cut to the chase now and talk about the issues of funding, because that's kind of really... And I love this graph. This is from the business consultation paper that came out in August. And you probably can't read it, but basically it's the proportion of hours of training that the average employee got in the UK over the last 30 years. And as you can see, it's basically about, it's kind of less than a third of what it was. If you had a similar graph for any other country in Europe, it would either be level or going up. We are uniquely bad at this. And the union's been saying this for a long, long time. This graph was produced after some really excellent research work that was done by a team at Lakes at the Institute of Education. And what was really surprising about it was that when it was presented to Sajid Javid, the Secretary of State, he looked at it in horror and realised just how bad the whole thing had gone. And it's that killer graph, I think, which is the main reason for the levy. Because the government has realised that this simply cannot go on. We can't have a system where employers are more or less giving up on training their own workers in anything beyond the minimum. Because the implications of that for the economy and for productivity and for skills are just too terrible to contemplate. And under the headlines, the government, I think, is very, very worried, and rightly so, about the productivity of the UK economy. It's just barely growing. It's just beginning to, and a bit more in some sectors than others. So that is why the levy is really being pushed by the government, because they saw that the market had broken. And as I said to Nick Bolt's minister, why is a free market government doing this? And he sort of laughed and said, well, Tom, when the market's broken, you fix the market. And that's why the levy's coming in.
But also, we've experienced this in CPD for even within professional fields.
Yes.
So there's something about the mindset of the employer in this country who's been there for a long time that doesn't value education, doesn't see the benefits, and tends to work on short-term agenda. It's not new, it's been around for a while.
But it was reinforced, if you look at the chart,
You
in
can
the
see
early
it's going
2000s when Train to Gain
Yeah.
was introduced. The idea that it wasn't the job of employers to pay for training,
Yes.
it was the job of the state.
It's interesting. I mean, successive government initiatives aimed at exhorting employers, the skills pledge, incentivising employers, Train to Gain, or directly funding them, the employer ownership programme, which, by the way, has burned through £330 million. There's nothing to show for it. So, directly funding, incentivising, exhorting, none of them would work. That's why this is happening, because they've tried everything else. They've tried the carrot, they have to do the stick. And it's interesting, your point is absolutely right. I think there are many, many employers in the UK who just haven't got the mindset that values and understands the importance of investing in employees. There are some very good ones, actually, often foreign-owned, Tata, EDF, even Rolls-Royce, foreign-owned big multinationals, because they're importing their own kind of culture. There are some good UK-based companies as well. And what they say is that they really want the levy, because it stops their investment being undercut by employees who don't invest. So they're quietly supporting the levy. What do I do so publicly? So I'm conscious I've been talking, I've only perhaps talked for another 5 minutes or so, but that's really why the levy is so important, because it is a real massive game changer. And you can't overstate, I think, the importance of it. The question is, should the unions really be so, if you like, unconditionally enthusiastic and the terrific. As you can see, SGW more or less said that, it's a model that's working successfully in more than 50 countries around the world. Every single country just about that has any advanced apprenticeship system has a levy, including Ireland. And it was when they discovered that Ireland had done it, I think that was the real killer punch, if you like, and they realised that it actually came in the UK. So, is that it? Happy apprentices? Is everything okay? Are we all going to be singing and smiling? Well, I would say it depends. And very quickly, I'll run through some of the key things that I think it depends on. Firstly, governance. As I said, I think it's important that the whole levy is designed in a way that includes all of the stakeholders, not just employers. Secondly, quality. I think you get what you pay for. And now that employers are required to pay fairly substantially into a pot, they should be absolutely insisting that they get the quality they're paying for. Now that will be challenging. There's not many FE colleges, and there's not many private providers that are up to the quality that employers will be demanding. So there's going to be a lot of change, I think, in the provision of apprenticeship systems. There'll have to be, because if employers can't find providers who will give it for them, they'll do it themselves. And I was talking to John Lewis, Chair John Lewis, and he said that's exactly what John Lewis was going to do. Because they couldn't find a provider that was good enough, they'd set up their own John Lewis Apprenticeship Academy, might call it something else, but that's what it would be, and they'd train people themselves. Now, they might not do that forever, they might start off doing that, and then want to sort of hive it off when they've got it going. But that's one of the implications of this relentless focus on quality. It will be a real challenge. Thirdly, I would say that training plans, apprenticeship agreements are very, very important. The whole point of an apprentice, if you think about going back to those 4 fundamentals I was outlining at the beginning, is that they're a kind of contract between the apprentice themselves, often their parents, the employer, the funder, and the provider, the college or whoever's doing it. So all of those people need to sign a piece of paper that sets out legally, I would say legally, exactly what their rights and obligations and responsibilities are. And in many other countries, that is exactly what happens. And the apprenticeship then has some protection, because they have to do things, but also the employer has to do things, the college has to do things. And if they don't, there's some kind of redress. It's more than just the homeschool charter that used to be in the vogue in schools not so long ago. It's got a lot more teeth than that. And the unions would strongly support that. I could talk in great detail, but I'm just going to jump to my kind of quick summary of the key points here, because I think they cover pretty much all the key kind of union points that I don't think they're just union points, by the way. I think many good employers would sign up to these. This is what a lot of NIACE, for example, the New Learning and Work Institute, they would support this kind of thing. We have a charter. There's a TUC charter on what counts as good in apprenticeships. You can look it up on our website if you like, and it includes those sorts of things. But that charter is also supported by many, many colleges around the country. And finally, I just thought I'd put up a cheerful-looking picture of some nice apprentices, because there are plenty of them out there. And one of the best things about this field is that they do inspire. I've gone around talking to loads of those apprentices, so I always come away feeling quite cheerful, because they're such a sort of jolly bunch, and they have such a great time, even though they've been treated awfully very often and paid almost nothing, and poor quality education. The employers aren't necessarily giving them a job, and yet they're so cheerful. And this particular scheme, the reason I finished on this note, was actually run by BECTU, the Broadcasting and Entertainment, I forget, anyway, it's the trade union.
Communications.
Thank you very much.
Legit union.
Very good, thank you.
I once applied for a job with them.
It's a shame. But BECTU is a wonderful union, they do lots and lots of work. And this particular project that they do is to help young BME people enter the film industry, which is, not exactly a haven of progressive employment, as you've seen from the recent Oscar stories. It's a great little program, very happy people. I just thought it was a good illustration of the kind of celebration of good apprenticeships and what they're all about that the union movement can bring to the party. And I should stop there because I've probably gone quite too long. There's lots more detail. Happy to take questions.
I'm struck by how narrow, limited and dismissive public debate about apprenticeships is as against other areas of people's formation and development in education, and what a challenge it is for people who work structurally in education to make their contributions work for the kind of hybrid function that you were describing apprenticeships have. And I think we all appreciate the kind of expertise and quietly thorough analysis that you've offered us as a base for a conversation, and very rich contribution, so thank you. Should we open it to the floor?
Just to point out, one of the things I'd be really interested in is what your thoughts are about what are the kind of key areas for kind of further work, further research and more exploration and so on, because it's such a vast canvas, it's hard to know where to start.
Michelle, then
Okay.
rising.
I just wondered whether there had been any analysis about the different levels of apprenticeships, on whether some of those characteristics around pay or BME or whatever varied according to whether the apprenticeship was a level 2, 3, 4 or so on.
I mean, currently 60% of all apprentices are level 2, 30% are 35% are level 3, and 5% are 4 or above. And the 5% are predominantly male, much higher paid. The level 3, level 2, it's these days much more evenly split, but it used to be the case, and it still is substantially in some sectors, that level 2 is as high as you get. So if you go into retail, you're very lucky to get an apprenticeship that goes beyond level 3. What a surprise, they're badly paid, and they're mostly done by women, young women. Ditto hair and beauty, it's almost impossible to get a hair and beauty apprenticeship that's level 3. Whereas in engineering and so on, that's level 3 is standard. So there is a difference, big difference.
And do you think employers will invest in higher level apprenticeships, or do you think that the levy will be used really around levels 2 and 3 and might reinforce some of the problems actually we've already got in the system?
I think it depends a lot on how the levy is designed, actually. I do think quite a lot of employers are currently put off from investing in apprentices because they can't find the kind of provision they think they need. And if somebody says to John Lewis, look, you're going to have to spend £150,000 a year, what do you need? What does your business need? They would objectively say, well, actually, we do need people who are, say, level 3, because those supervisory management skills to do with IT, with stock control, all that kind of stuff is just as important as shelf stackers and people serving on the checkout, so to speak. Tesco's wouldn't say that. Tesco's have said to me that level 2, that's it. They don't see any need for anything beyond level 2, because that's all Tesco's do, is just checkout and shelf stackers and logistics, and maybe a few people in the warehouse or management. I think they're changing. And I think the levy will have the effect of forcing employers to think much, much more deeply about how they design apprenticeships. And I do think if I was a half-decent employee, you'd say, well, okay, the standard route might be level 2, but there's a chance for those who want to, who've got the aptitude to go to level 3. I mean, why wouldn't you say that? Then at least you've got the chance of growing. A common problem is that level 3 apprenticeships are often thought to include management. And there's an awful lot of jobs that are at level 3 that don't involve management, but because people think it involves management, they therefore think, oh, well, I couldn't do that, I'm only 21 or something, I'm never going to be a manager, so level 2 is all I can aspire to. So, you have to kind of design the frameworks in a way that will actually attract people and encourage them to kind of make the best of what they've got.
Yeah, I was going to ask a bit about the higher apprenticeship issue, because obviously as a university, we're interested in developing that, and we do have at Deputy Vice Chancellor level work going on looking at apprenticeships, higher apprenticeships. But the other thing is, I suppose, it's interesting that the NHS has adopted the apprenticeship in a big way. Of course, it's a public service, it's under the cosh of the government to some extent. There's a big push in that direction. You talked about the shortness of the apprenticeships in this country, and so my question really is, if they continue to be short, cheap approaches, it's going to give apprenticeships a really bad name, both for people going into them and for anybody else. So with the levy, will there be a change in the quality of the apprenticeships, do you think, not just the number of them really, I suppose?
I think yes, but it'll be a much more diverse sector. And unlike higher education, where to some extent a degree is a degree is a degree, within the world of apprenticeships, because an apprenticeship isn't a qualification, it's just a kind of an approach, a framework, what will emerge is, well, that particular apprenticeship is pretty good, but that one isn't. So some bits of the NHS will acquire reputations for delivering very good reputations, others won't. Some sectors will be seen as worth going into because they pay well and they tend to be level 3 and so on. Others won't. So it'll be a much more varied and diverse picture, which is partly why I think it's so important to get much better careers advice and guidance to young people so they can make the right apprenticeship, not just grab any old apprenticeship, but the right one for them that's going to actually lead to something. So I think quality will gradually emerge, but it'll be quite patchy and variable at first. And it'll take a while, I think, for pressure from young people and their parents to begin to kind of encourage more employers to do what they should do. And from unions. I think unions have got a big part to play here in pushing employers to do, the average employer in a sector should aspire to the best employer in that sector.
You don't think that the 3 million target is going to produce a race to the bottom?
I think that 3 million target is a bit bogus, to be honest. I don't think that that bothered by it. I know they say they are.
But it struck me that in the 5 years the government's been there, it's been talking about apprenticeships the whole time. And we've seen a replication of the kind of problems we have with training to gain around adult apprenticeships, the renaming of people's existing skills, no value being added, and a kind of reputational denigration of apprenticeship as a model. That's a picture which I think there's a real risk will carry on through this period. And what you just said about, well, people need to know what's a good one, what isn't, and be canny about the choices they make. I mean, for apprenticeship in the UK to aspire to the kind of conditions you find in Germany or elsewhere in continental Europe, don't you have to move from a kind of naming of an approach to guarantees of the sorts of rights you would have as a person undertaking an apprenticeship that leads you towards being able to say, I've done it and therefore I'm able to do this in the way that the way that you were describing somebody who was a plasterer at the beginning.
I would hope so, but I think it'll take time and it'll vary by industry. So it'll be true in construction, you'll get plastering, dry lining, metal cladding, all that, and they will be exactly like that. In retail, you might get something that's much more wishy-washy and it's hard to pin down.
Those of you who are in colleges, it strikes me that you're on a hiding to nothing in a way. Endlessly, you've been describing a be fit for purpose for employers, and colleges can do the things that they will be funded to do. I wondered what it looked like from your point of view. I'm not sure of other people from colleges.
I think it's difficult from our point of view in terms of it's been mentioned about a good employer or a good apprentice, and then in addition to that, we're raising the participation age. So when you are in further education establishments, you attract, or are in a particular locality, you attract a certain demographic of individual. So it's people that have been on benefits or things for a period of time, and now there is an agenda that they are 16 to 18 and they come to a college to do an apprenticeship, and then when they are vetted or initially assessed to go on to that apprenticeship, they are not ready. And then we are targeted with large numbers in terms of this is how much revenue needs to be generated, this is how many apprenticeships need to go through this month. And I think in terms of quality and being with an employer, you do get unfit for purpose apprenticeships. And then in addition to that, you have awarding bodies that write curriculum or criteria that when an assessor is actually assessing a learner, it doesn't marry up. So they go out and, for instance, there's a retail qualification that aspires to have somebody that needs face-to-face contact, good relationship, being able to build rapport. However, they sit down in a classroom and do 9 mandatory written units. So when in terms of a good apprenticeship, a quality apprentice, that journey isn't quick. It's very long in terms of it starts with even pre-traineeship. It starts with ESOL, pre-traineeship, traineeship, apprenticeship, and that apprenticeship is at level 2. And when you are going out to market to employers, it's I need a manager or I need somebody that's able to do something that's quite progressive and in depth, and no, I cannot take on a level 2 apprentice. So in terms of the government agenda and working with SMEs and trying to get employers on board, I think it's very difficult when you are a further education establishment and you are working particularly individual where school has failed in the first instance.
I agree. I think there's a shortage of people who are good enough to do a good quality apprenticeship. And I mean, the HE participation rate currently is about 43 in England, I think. And if we got to 3 million apprentices, that would be about another 13. That doesn't leave too many over to do all the other things. And that's the fundamental problem.
And again, it comes down to initial assessment and advice and guidance. So when you have got people that have got the skills to look at these individuals that come in without a GCSE or without a functional skill, and you have a college agenda and targets to meet in terms of it's everything's employee focus, you basically setting that person up for a fail from the very beginning, which is something that isn't being recognised anywhere.
And you're setting colleges up to fail, I think.
Yeah.
One of the things that's implicit there, which I think governments had problems with targeting and allocating resources, which I don't know what stance trade unions take on it, is the length of time from where you start to where you're going to be efficient in the labour market. If you look at ESOL policy, there's masses of people at absolute beginner level 15 years ago. Now Mr. Cameron saying suddenly we need to reinvent them, but they stopped funding because basically the pipeline was longer than it suited the target setters to recognise. But if you want to make a difference to people's lives, you need to be there, don't you? And I just wondered how hard the trade unions push that case.
Not as hard as we should have done, to be perfectly frank. And I think that's partly why progression, I was talking about 30%, 50%, 70%. I mean, that's part of this, because I think if you replace 1 year apprenticeships with 3 years, because that's much more realistic in terms of the progression of the learner to reach a certain standard, then the quid pro quo of that might well be that the initial rate is actually pretty low. And that's fair enough, provided that you can aspire, if you achieve, to get to the 70% by year 3. And that's what I think the unions should be doing, is pushing very hard for that sense of relation. So you're arguing for a 3-year apprenticeship, realistically, because that's how long it can take to get to a certain standard, and accepting that there'll be a quid pro quo for that.
That would make sense, wouldn't it, from what you're saying? You'd actually not be setting people up to fail, you'd be giving them a pathway into which they could develop and grow. That would be really helpful.
It is, because you have a pre-traineeship programme that's anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks, and in all intents and purposes, if you've got students that are ESOL or lower level students that are E2 or E3, in terms of the demographic of individual too, their attendance isn't great either. So when they don't attend in the first instance, that 6 to 8 weeks is only possibly 12 lessons over a period of time. So if you miss 5 of them, you cut yourself back anyway. So I think what actually goes on for policymakers and people that sit higher up isn't realistic of what you deal with on the floor, as it were. And I think that's the battle that we're trying to fight. One of the things that was mentioned was the Michael Wiltshire quote. It's only very recently that now apprenticeships are being assessed or reviewed in terms of what goes on in the workplace as a part of your Ofsted inspection. It never used to. So the quality of learning was never there, and the employer wasn't involved. And I think in terms of the quality, the employer does need to be involved and have set guidelines of what's expected and what isn't.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that's part of employers being in the driving seat. A lot of employers don't want to be in the driving seat, but I think they should be. They should have that responsibility.
Well, I'm just really overwhelmed by what you've covered today, and I think it's important to say that from the point of view of this university, we do look very closely at routes through and into careers, occupations. And it's really interesting that there's this issue which we've identified, which is lack of engagement with employers in an or a more cynical approach to certain employers, and the difficulty of career advice and so on, enabling people to move forward. I have to say it isn't exclusively that affecting apprentices, but one of the things that's really interesting is when you get relationships between placements, significant placements, in an employer environment where the employer has responsibilities which are clearly identified, you tend to get a very different set of circumstances, and it becomes a mutual benefit. And of course the the people that win out best of all are those people who are going through the process, and indeed, it has to be said, the employees themselves at the end. It's just that we need to kind of make people see the relationship between that model, which I think people respect and value, and things like sandwich courses and those sorts of things, and apprenticeships. And I would just say that one of the things for me that perhaps means that people say it's fine for other people's kids but not mine, is actually seeing where it can lead.
Yes.
And into something which is really significant. So maybe looking at the pathways through and demonstrating that would be really important as well. But thank you very much indeed, Tom, and this is just a gift to say thank you for being a very excellent speaker, and we're delighted that you are here as a fellow of the University of Wolverhampton. So can we just say thanks once more?